Now that the bracketology reports have updated, where are the experts projecting the Zags to play next week, and which matchups might be most ideal for Mark Few's club?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Thursday, folks, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things just a little bit further? Have you ever wondered what adventure could be just around the corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today on nissanusa.com. All right, folks, we got an updated look at the latest bracketology updates now that Gonzaga's loss to SMC is finalized, what that means for Gonzaga in terms of where the experts expect them to get seated after Selection Sunday next week. We also got a look at the best and worst potential first and second round matchups for Gonzaga. If we're expecting them in that 6, 7, 8 seed range, who are those 9, 10, 11 seeds that are the trickiest matchups, perhaps the less tricky matchups, and then looking ahead to those second round games against potential top 3 seeded teams. We're also going to give a kind of rooting guide, and I'm hoping to do this for the next couple of episodes. Just here are the games to watch. Here are the teams to be rooting for. If these teams lose, it could help Gonzaga potentially bump up a seed line. We're going to get to that later in the show as well, but want to start with the bracketology update. Because on yesterday's show, we recorded after Gonzaga's loss to St. Mary's. We kind of talked about what this means for the Zags, my projections for what I think it means for them in terms of how far down the seed line they're going to fall. Are they going to fall into that 8-9 territory? Are they going to stay a 7 seed, 6 seed? Are they going to fall into, play-in territory, which we kind of ruled out in yesterday's show? And certainly, as we look now at the bracketologists, which many of them who produce their own content on a regular basis are updating their brackets on a day-to-day basis. So quite a few people had updated brackets that came out on Wednesday after Gonzaga's loss to St. Mary's. I gathered up 7 of them. We're going to talk about where Gonzaga is seated in each of them. And more or less what we talked about on Wednesday's show is kind of coming to fruition here. A lot of places didn't drop the Zags all that much, and they shouldn't have, because Gonzaga lost to a really good team. They didn't get blown out. They only led that game for 22 seconds, but that's not a metric that folks are using to determine what constitutes a blowout. St. Mary's never led that game by more than 11 points. It was a 9-point margin of victory. Losing to a team on a neutral site by 9 that is a top 20 team in every metric system is just not a resume killer in any way, shape, or form. So for Gonzaga, unexpectedly, this loss didn't do a whole lot to alter their resume. So we're going to talk about where each of these bracketologists had them. We're going to start with Rocco Miller, a friend of the program's, talked with him a handful of times in the past, does some great bracketology work. He has Gonzaga as a 6 seed. That's not why I'm gassing him up on the show, although he is the highest on the Zags right now of the 7 brackets that I looked at that updated after the St. Mary's game. He has Gonzaga as a 6 seed in Omaha, taking on an 11-seeded Princeton team. That's not a particularly fun matchup. Princeton is very, very good. Their second round game would be against a 3 seed in Iowa State. Next up is Joe Lunardi. Of course, Lunardi is the bracketologist most well known. He is the ESPN bracketologist. It is worth acknowledging that he is typically not the most accurate bracketologist. He is, in fact, not often one of the top 10 most accurate bracketologists among people who submit to the bracket matrix, but he is the most popular and most well-known and most discussed bracketologist out there. He has Gonzaga as a 7 seed playing in Charlotte, not a particularly fun draw geographically for Gonzaga. He has them facing a 10-seeded TCU team. Now, this came out again on Wednesday morning. Since then, TCU did beat Oklahoma in the Big 12 tournament. I don't think that moves the needle much for TCU other than giving them more opportunities. If they then go on and advance and beat teams, they'll potentially, if they keep advancing, they could play teams like Iowa State. They could play teams like Houston. I would normally throw Kansas in there, but as I'm recording right now, they are about to get completely obliterated obliterated by Cincinnati. That is a wild result in the Big 12 right now. Regardless, TCU has opportunities to potentially bump themselves up a little bit. The main thing about Lunardi's bracket that many of you probably saw is that Gonzaga would be a 7 seed in Charlotte, taking on a 2 seed in North Carolina. That is a very unfortunate draw if that were to come together. Thinking about Gonzaga as a 7 seed potentially upsetting North Carolina in Charlotte is really beautiful to think about, but that is a really rough draw were that to come together. Andy Katz, NCAA correspondent, he has Gonzaga as a 7 seed. He didn't list locations or specific regions on his update, but he has them as a 7 seed. He has them taking on a 10-seeded Seton Hall team out of the Big East. With that second round matchup, this is the one people were expecting to potentially see, a second round matchup against Tommy Lloyd and the Arizona Wildcats. We'll talk a little bit more about both those potential matchups later in the show. Then Bleacher Report, they did an updated bracketology report as well, having Gonzaga also as a 7 seed. You're starting to see a theme here. In Memphis, they would take on a 10-seeded Texas A&M team out of the SEC. Frankly, as somebody who's watched a fair amount of SEC basketball this year, I am stunned that Texas A&M is in consideration for a 10 seed for an NCAA tournament spot at all. Kind of an indication of the weakness of the bubble. A&M's a little scary in the sense that they're super reliant on the three-point shot. They have some very talented guards, but they're really inconsistent. We'll see how A&M does in the SEC tournament. I wouldn't be surprised if they're not even in the field by the time this thing rolls around. Katz also has Gonzaga potentially facing Arizona in the second round as well. Marquette. Bleacher Report has 10 seed Texas A&M, the 2 seed would be Marquette. Again, we'll talk about the Golden Eagles a little bit later in the show as well. Mike DeCourcy at FS1 Fox Sports' bracketologist has Gonzaga as a, you guessed it, 7 seed, this time playing in Indianapolis against a 10-seeded Seton Hall team. That's a popular potential matchup for Gonzaga. And then the 2 seed in this one would be Iowa State. So we see Iowa State as a potential second-round matchup for Gonzaga as a 3-6 and as a 2-7 matchup there. Jerry Palm at CBS, a very popular bracketologist, one of the probably most well-known outside of Lunardi. He has Gonzaga as an 8 seed. So we do see some people potentially projecting Gonzaga to fall onto that 8-9 line. He has them as an 8 seed out in Charlotte, taking on a 9-seeded Texas Longhorns program, with the 1 seed being Tennessee. Not a particularly fun draw here, worth acknowledging. Texas lost to Kansas State in the first round of the Big 12 tournament after this bracketology was reported. I think Texas is going to fall into that play-in 10-11 seed territory. Frankly, I wouldn't be shocked if we end up with a situation where the Longhorns are not even in the field of 68 by the time this thing rolls around on Sunday. And then finally, the Washington Post, they have Gonzaga also as an 8 seed in Indianapolis. The 9 seed they're facing is Colorado State, the Rams. The 1 seed is Purdue. Not sure there is a tougher draw. I know Gonzaga fans would be upset about getting a 7 seed where your 2 seed is North Carolina in Charlotte, but getting an 8 seed in Indianapolis where your 1 seed is Purdue, that is just plain cruel. Hopefully that does not come to fruition, because not only is that a tough draw for Gonzaga in the second round, Colorado State's a pretty tough team as well. They beat San Jose State on Wednesday night, may have slightly helped their bracketology odds, although San Jose State's not a particularly good team. It does give Colorado State, again, more opportunities to pick up bigger wins as the Mountain West tournament goes on. A little bit on Gonzaga's resume. They're 17th in the net. They were 16th they were 16th yesterday. They're 17th now. So only dropped 1 spot after losing to St. Mary's. Again, they just flipped, which is kind of what we thought was going to happen. So Gonzaga is still 17th in the net. They're still 3-6 quad 1, 4-1 in quad 2. That puts them 7-7 combined. Last year, the number 17 net team before the NCAA tournament was Creighton. Creighton earned a 6 seed. Do with that what you will. It doesn't certainly not a hard and fast rule. In 2022, the pre-NCAA tournament number 17 net team was North Carolina, and they earned an 8 seed. So we're kind of right in that range with where Gonzaga is, again, using very limited 2-year data on the net data. I think KenPom, Gonzaga is still 16th at KenPom right now. Last year, the 16th KenPom team pre-tournament was Duke. They ended up getting a 5 seed in 2022. The 16th KenPom ranked team pre-tournament was St. Mary's. They also got a 5 seed. So I don't think Gonzaga is going to climb onto the 5 seed line, but worth acknowledging that with top 20 metrics at KenPom and net, the Zags may end up sneaking into a decent conversation. But what we need to know is what else is going to happen, because there are a lot of basketball still to be played. Gonzaga may be done, but there are big-time basketball games, every single Power 6 conference tournament going on right now. So which games leading into this week, or which games leading into Selection Sunday should Gonzaga fans be watching? Who should they be rooting for? We're going to get to all of that. Ask for a word from today's sponsor, Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things just a little bit further? Do you ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. And if you need something, you can call on the class-exclusive built-in Google Assistant. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and the Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. And the 2024 Rogue is the perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. Or how about the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder, which has room for up to 8 in expansive cargo capacity and advanced available 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds of towing capacity, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. So take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking bracketology for the next couple of episodes until Selection Sunday. And then we get to have a whole fun week of previewing Gonzaga's region, their matchups, their path back to the Sweet 16, back to the Elite Eight, continuing to fight to get into that national championship conversation. Going to be doing it with a little lower seed than we're used to seeing for the last couple of years. Before we get into the games to watch on Thursday, I want a couple updates from Wednesday. Again, all of the bracketology games that we talked about, bracketology reports that we talked about were published before Wednesday's games. There's 2 games in particular that I think are notable for Gonzaga's potential seed. One of them out of the ACC, Boston College obliterated Clemson in the first round of the ACC tournament, 76-55. Now, Clemson losing early in the ACC tournament was always going to hurt them from a seed perspective. A lot of places have Clemson as a 5 seed. Some places have them as a 6 seed. Occasionally you see them as a 7 seed, but they're generally projected as a 5-6 seed. Had they lost a close game to Boston College, we'd probably still talk about it, but it wouldn't be a big deal. But getting blasted by a pretty average to below average Boston College team probably pushes Clemson fairly far. Clemson's resume has always been a little bit tepid. They had a great non-conference. They struggled in conference play early on. They kind of turned it around a little bit. But to me, this kind of loss, and the fact that Clemson now no longer they don't get cracks at Virginia or Carolina or Duke. They don't get those opportunities. I think Clemson could fall to the 7 line. I think Clemson could fall to the 8 line potentially, depending on some of the games that happen around them. So this is great news for Gonzaga. This is one of the teams that they were competing with for a seed line in that 6-7 range. Clemson losing to Boston College could potentially help the Zags. It probably has more of an impact on the Gales of St. Mary's, who probably are almost certainly more likely to get a 6 seed now, with Clemson probably falling down at least to a 7 seed with this loss. But for the Zags, it could be a benefit as well. I touched on this game already as well. Colorado State beat San Jose State by 10. A loss would have probably helped the Zags a little bit. Colorado State's not projected as high as Gonzaga at most places. We're seeing them as an 8-9, maybe a 10. So a loss wouldn't have done a bunch necessarily. A win also doesn't do a whole lot just because San Jose State's not very good. What it does mean is that Colorado State gets another game against Nevada, who they will play on Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific time. That game will be on the CBS Sports Network. And we're rooting for the Wolfpack because Nevada's projected as a 5 seed. The Nevada losing to Colorado State probably doesn't move them far enough down to really help Gonzaga. Whereas if Colorado State were to pull the upset and advance in the Mountain West tournament and potentially also beat somebody like San Diego State or Boise State, they could then climb into that 6-7 seed conversation and potentially cause Gonzaga to get bumped. So Nevada, who we're rooting for against Colorado State on Thursday, again, 6 p.m. on the CBS Sports Network. Here are a handful of other games going on Thursday. I'm going to give you the times. I'm going to give you the teams. And I'm going to give you who we should be rooting for if we want Gonzaga to get the best possible seed in the Big Dance. Starting in the Big Ten, we got Wisconsin taking on Maryland Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time on the Big Ten Network. We are rooting for a Wisconsin loss. So we are all in on the Terps in this game. Wisconsin has struggled significantly towards the end of the year here. An early Big Ten loss, losing the opportunity to take on Purdue, to take on Michigan State, to take on Illinois, some of those other teams in the Big Ten, is really devastating for Wisconsin. We're still seeing them in that 5-6 seed conversation. A lot of people, if you click on any bracketologist's updated report on Twitter, most of the conversation underneath is like, why is Wisconsin so high? Why is Michigan State so high? Like, that seems to be a hot button issue for fans right now. If Wisconsin were to lose to Maryland, it very likely forces them to be reevaluated and potentially pushes them closer to that 7-8 line, which could be beneficial for the Zags. Moving over to the SEC, Florida taking on Georgia in the SEC tournament. That game will be at 6 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday on the SEC Network. We're rooting for Todd Golden and the Gators to get upset here. We're rooting for Mike White and the Bulldogs of Georgia. Their resume is the weakest among the 6-7 seeds that we talked about on Wednesday's show. If they lose early in the SEC tournament, if they lose to Georgia in particular, who's just not a very good basketball team, that probably pushes Florida fully out of the 6, 7, 8, 9 seed potential conversation. I think that pushes Florida down in that 10 seed conversation, and some things going on around them could even push Florida back onto that bubble conversation. So want to see Georgia pull off a win here, because if Florida rattles off a couple W's in the SEC tournament, they kind of start to compete with some of those 6, 7 seed spots for the Zags. Pac-12, Washington State, Kyle Smith's squad taking on Stanford at 9 p.m. on Thursday on the Pac-12 network. We are rooting for the Cardinals of Stanford. Even those of you who are kind of Gonzaga, Wazoo, you're fans of both. You're Eastern Washington fans. I get it. Stanford winning is better for Gonzaga, because right now Wazoo is a little ahead of Gonzaga in seeding expectations. They're a 6 seed, sometimes even a 5 seed. A loss to Stanford is a bad loss. Stanford's not a very good team. It prevents Wazoo from, again, picking up other opportunities to play Arizona again, to play even Colorado, Utah, some of those decent Pac-12 teams again. It probably pushes them closer to that 7-8, so they're more comparable with Gonzaga. You could make the argument that Wazoo losing pushes them down, maybe even pushes Gonzaga down. I suppose that could happen, but I think it's more likely Wazoo winning games doesn't impact Gonzaga as much, but if Wazoo loses this one, I think it could potentially bump Gonzaga a little bit from a seeding perspective. And then over in the Big 12, Texas Tech taking on BYU, 9:30 in the morning on Thursday. Hopefully you don't have too much you got to do at work today, so you can watch this one, ESPN2. We are rooting for a Texas Tech loss. I want to phrase it that way because I don't like saying out loud that we're rooting for a BYU victory, because that is not fun to say out loud, but Texas Tech is a 7 seed in most projections right now. If they lose to BYU, it probably pushes them closer to that 8, 9, maybe even 10 seed territory, opens up more availability for a 7 seed. Meanwhile, BYU is already projected as a 6 or a 5 in many places. If they continue to win, they'll stay up in that 5, 6 seed conversation. Whereas a loss, while it would be, a little bit fun to see BYU lose earlier in the Big 12 tournament that they're expecting, I don't know that it helps Gonzaga for them to lose as much as it would help Gonzaga for Texas Tech to take a loss here. And then finally, Mountain West tournament, Utah State taking on the Bulldogs of Fresno State, noon Pacific time on Thursday on the CBS Sports Network. We are all in on our fellow Bulldogs to pull off an upset here. Fresno State has not been good this year. They are not a good basketball team. They beat Wyoming to advance in the Mountain West tournament to take on the Aggies of Utah State. Utah State's generally projected ahead of Gonzaga right now, but a loss to Fresno State would be pretty devastating, because again, this Bulldogs team is not good. And the committee are always going to be harsher on mid-major programs, to the chagrin of myself and many others, but it is true. And if Utah State gets beat by a Fresno State team that is worse than pretty much every Power 6 team out there outside of DePaul and Louisville and Michigan, weirdly enough, if Utah State loses to Fresno State, that could push Utah State from a 6, 5 seed all the way to that 8, 9 seed conversation. Whether that's justified or not is a conversation for another time, but it would be beneficial for Gonzaga if Utah State were to lose early in the Mountain West tournament, cost themselves opportunities to take on the Nevadas and the Boise States and the San Diego States of the world, and force them to be just waiting to find out what seed they're going to get on Selection Sunday. Well, we're going to close out the show looking at the 9 seed, 10 seed, 11 seed projections, the top seeds as well. Basically, any team that Gonzaga could conceivably match up with in either the first or second round of the 2024 NCAA tournament, and who are the best and who are the worst matchups for Mark Few's team. All of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Amazon Fire TV. Folks, Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. And Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's March Madness or opening weekend for the MLB season, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. I have Amazon Fire Sticks on literally every single TV in my house because I love the layout. It is a very good user experience, which is not true of a lot of media companies right now. Plus the remote, it's super handy. It has little buttons that can take you directly to Prime Video or to Netflix, Disney Plus, and Hulu. Those are the 4 that I'm going to more than just about anything else. Fire TV also recently created Fire TV channels, which deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. And folks, that includes all of us at Locked On. So you can go watch Locked On shows for free on your Amazon Fire TV stick. They also have big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep you up to date on the latest world of sports. So check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. To learn more, visit amazon.com/lockedonfiretv. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy. And it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts to choose from for your ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, closing out the show today, continuing to talk about bracketology as we are 3 days away, from the Selection Sunday, March 17th, coming up this week, where the Zags might go, who they might play. More mystery this year than we've seen in the past, the last couple of years in particular, where they've been, in many cases, cemented as a number 1 seed, in some cases, maybe a 2 or 3. This year, there's a little bit more mystery. Could be a 6, could be a 7, could be an 8. Could be playing in Charlotte, could be in Omaha, could be in Indianapolis, like a lot more mystery and a lot more teams they could potentially play. So what I want to do now is lay out some first round teams, but mostly teams in that 9, 10, 11 seed range that I think are good matchups for Gonzaga, some second round games, 2, 3 seeds that I think are good matchups for Gonzaga, and then some not so good matchups and some more neutral matchups. So looking at the best matchups for Gonzaga in the first round. One that we heard a handful of times in that first segment, Seton Hall. The Pirates, I love Shaheen Holloway. He's a great coach. The fact that he's gotten the Seton Hall team into the NCAA tournament most likely is a really good testament to how bad they were 2 years ago to take over that program after his miracle run as the coach of the St. Peter's Peacocks to now having this team in that big dance conversation. Huge testament. But they have struggled lately. And they're a good offensive team, but they're inconsistent. They have veteran guards, which veteran guards is usually something that I don't want to face in the NCAA tournament, but they're really reliant on Kadari Richmond. He's very good. He's put up multiple triple doubles this year. He's very, very talented, bigger guard, which can give Gonzaga some trouble. They don't have a lot of size in the front court. Their starting center is Jaden Bediako, who was at Santa Clara the last couple of years. Good player, not a great player, decent offensive rebounder. I think they're going to struggle against Graham Ike if they were to play that matchup. I think Gonzaga would find ways, maybe even throw Anton Watson on Kadari Richmond. He's a 6'6" guard. It could work. I think that's a decent matchup for Gonzaga. We've also seen Gonzaga matched up against Texas. Now, again, Texas lost to Kansas State. I think that might push them closer to the bubble and likely put them outside of the range in which Gonzaga might play them. But Texas has a depth issue in a major way. They've had off and on injuries with Dylan Dessou, who would be a tough matchup for Gonzaga were he healthy. They don't have a lot of front court offense. Caden Shedrick's a good defensive player, which I think could be a problem for Graham Ike, but I don't think Texas, I think they're a little overrated. And I think the fact that they lost to Kansas State kind of indicates that. And I'd be fairly surprised if they are in that 10-11 seed range. I'd be fairly surprised if they're in that 9-10 seed range. I wouldn't be shocked if they're like a play-in 11 seed, but I think Texas is a little overrated, and I think that's a good matchup for Gonzaga if they get them. And then Texas A&M. I already talked about A&M in the first segment. I won't spend too much time here. Wade Taylor IV is a great guard. Tyrese Radford, great guard. Those two guys sometimes combine to shoot like 10% from three. I've seen multiple box scores this year where Wade Taylor's like 3 of 14 from three. Those guys can shoot that team into games, and they can shoot them out of games. I just don't think that they are a consistent enough team, frankly, to be in the NCAA tournament picture. And I think if Gonzaga were to draw them, yeah, it's a little scary that those two guards can really shoot it. They don't have a ton of front court presence. They don't have an answer for Graham Ike. They have to get nuclear hot from three to beat anybody in the big dance. I would trust Gonzaga in that one. Some second-round teams that Gonzaga could conceivably face that I think are decent matchups for them. Iowa State, this team has been bad away from home. We saw them twice in the recent bracketology as either a 3-seed facing 6-seeded Gonzaga or a 2-7. Iowa State's, they're talented. Don't get me wrong. Tim Lipsey is very good. TJ Otzelberger is a fantastic coach. This team has struggled away from home, and they are a not very good offensive team. Second-ranked defensive team in the country, according to KenPom. So it's going to be a bit of a slog of a game to get through, but I like Gonzaga against Iowa State if they get that matchup. And then Duke. Always fun to play Duke. Duke doesn't have any rim protection. I'm not sure who's going to guard Graham Ike. Kyle Filipowski, that's not his game. He's a matchup nightmare for Gonzaga on the other end of the floor, although they got Anton Watson, who I think will really help neutralize him and allow Graham Ike to not have to have a big defensive role. If Graham Ike doesn't have a big defensive role, he likely doesn't commit as many fouls. Graham Ike is on the court for 35 minutes. I like Gonzaga against Duke. Then there's Auburn. Auburn has been very bad away from home. They have very few quad one victories. They haven't played well against particularly great opponents. They have very inconsistent young guard play. I like the Zags against the Tigers as well. Looking at some of the worst matchups Gonzaga could conceivably face, if they drew Tom Izzo and Michigan State in the first round, if they threw Michigan State on the 10 line, threw Gonzaga on the 7 line, that is a huge bummer. Especially if they do it somewhere like Indianapolis or Omaha, somewhere vaguely closer to East Lansing than Spokane, which most places are that are hosting regionals this year. Never bet against Tom Izzo in March. Never bet against veteran teams with a lot of older guards in March. Tom Izzo's and Michigan State has that in spades. That's a tough matchup for Gonzaga. I also don't love Colorado State as a matchup for Gonzaga. Isaiah Stevens is one of the best mid-major guards in the entire country. He's one of the best guards in the country, period. They're a slow-paced team. I think they could dictate pace against Gonzaga, slow them down a little bit. Isaiah Stevens could go off in a big way. Nico Medved's a very good coach. I don't love a matchup against the Rams. And then Northwestern, they were hungry for a rematch from that 2017 NCAA tournament when Zach Collins blocked a shot underneath the rim, and that ended up ending Northwestern season early. They're also a slow-paced team. They're also a highly efficient top 30 offense. I think they're a similar-ish version to St. Mary's, and I think they could cause problems for Gonzaga. Second-round teams that would be bad matchups, basically all the 1 seeds. Purdue, Houston, UConn, I lumped them all together. All those are bad matchups for Gonzaga. Now, Gonzaga has played both Purdue and UConn, which I think helps. It helps both teams to an extent, but Gonzaga knows what didn't work against Purdue. They played really well in the first half of that game. They proved that they could potentially beat Purdue the way they played in that first half of that game. They're a much better team than they were then. They're also a much better team than they were in December when they took on UConn as well. However, both those teams are just so good. Houston, really bad matchup for Gonzaga. Really bad. Houston is insanely good this year. Defensively, they are lights out. They have big physical guards in Jamal Shead and LJ Cryer. That's a very bad matchup for Gonzaga. I also think North Carolina is a bad matchup for Gonzaga. Veteran experience. Armando Bacot is an absolute load. He would get Graham Ike in foul trouble very quickly, which would be a nightmare for the Zags. RJ Davis is playing like the best player in college basketball, not named Zach Edey. Cormac Ryan's a good outside shooter. Harrison Ingram's a big physical 4 that I think can kind of neutralize Anton Watson. Very tough matchup. Tennessee as well. Dalton Connect has been an offensive boost for Tennessee and their elite defensive team. They're deep, they're experienced, they're physical, very, very physical, and they have a high-level scoring wing, which is a tough matchup for Gonzaga to handle defensively. I wouldn't want to see Tennessee at all in this big dance. And then some teams that I'm a little bit more neutral on. First round teams, Oklahoma, TCU, and Drake. TCU and Oklahoma played each other on Wednesday night. TCU picked up a victory. Would obviously be a rematch of last year's second round game in the NCAA tournament. I don't know enough about these teams, or also I see some positives and some negatives. I don't think Oklahoma's that good, but I think Porter Moser's a very good coach. TCU has experience against Gonzaga. Drake is a very, very hungry mid-major team. There's some pros and cons to both of those. And then second round teams that I'm a little bit more neutral on, Marquette, partly because Tyler Kolek injury situation is spotty. He is going to be playing in the NCAA tournament, but is he 100%? He suffered an oblique injury and missed the final 2 games of Marquette's regular season and is going to miss the Big East tournament. If he is at 100%, Marquette's a scary, tough team. Him and Oso Ighodaro, very, very talented. If he's not at 100%, I would not mind drawing Marquette as a 2 seed with Gonzaga as the 7 seed. And then Arizona. The pros and cons are obvious. Arizona's very good. They play a similar style to Gonzaga. They have really, really talented players at every single starting position. And Tommy Lloyd knows Gonzaga's offense better than anybody on the planet who's not currently on Gonzaga's roster. Flip side, Gonzaga knows Tommy Lloyd. Gonzaga knows Arizona. Flip side is Arizona struggles defensively. Flip side is Arizona has lost some ugly games this year. Colorado State, Oregon State, Washington State, which is admittedly not that bad of a loss, Stanford, etc. Pros and cons to playing Arizona in this tournament. We'll see if the committee decides to put it together. The fact that Gonzaga can conceivably line up as a 7 seed, the fact that Arizona can conceivably line up as a 2 seed, at least as of right now, the fact that both teams are on the West Coast, the fact that they know the narrative story between Gonzaga and Arizona and Tommy Lloyd and Mark Few, I wouldn't be surprised if the committee does everything they can to put that matchup together. That's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. We'll be back on Friday with a rooting guide for the weekend, games to watch, teams to root for, etc., and some more preparation for Selection Sunday and the official start of the madness that is March. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. And until next time, as always, go Zags.